My name is Marco, and I'm a philosopher at Massey University in Auckland. I specialize in political philosophy and in ethics, and today I'll tell you a bit about how I ended up here, quite a distance away from my origins in former East Germany. Some of you may have wondered why the title of my talk mentions Lenin. Is he a socialist, or worse, is he a commie, you might ask? Well, at least I was at some point, because I grew up in the German Democratic Republic after all. The part of Germany that considered itself socialist. I'm from a place about 40 to 50 kilometers outside of Berlin. When I was little, I went through all the state-operated parts of the educational and political system. For instance, at age 6, I joined the Young Pioneers. At age 10, I became a Tailman pioneer. And age 14, I enlisted in the Free German Youth. All of these were kind of like the Scouts, but with socialist doctrine and socialist practices, of course. If you're immersed in that kind of community, and especially when you grow up in it, absorbing that doctrine and taking on the practices performed around you happens pretty much automatically. So for that reason alone, it makes sense to label my younger self a socialist. But that's not actually why Lenin is in the title of my webinar. Instead, and some of you will already suspect that, it's a reference to a movie from 2003. I highly recommend it. I'm sure it's on the streaming service that starts with N. Anyway, the film's about the end of East Germany. It's about the woman you can see in the picture, call her Christine. She falls into a coma just before the Berlin Wall comes down. And when Christine wakes up a few months later, the doctor says she can't have any stress or excitement because it would kill her, because she's still so weak. The problem is, during the months of her coma, former East Germany has changed so radically, it's virtually impossible to avoid stress and excitement. For example, if Christine were to set foot in a supermarket, she would die immediately. I'll come back to that thought in just a minute. Now, when the Berlin Wall came down, I was 16. The end of East Germany came quite unexpectedly, and it happened so quickly. I remember walking into our kitchen and telling my parents, I just saw on TV the border crossings to West Germany are open. And they were like, what are you talking about? Don't be silly. But I was right, they were. Here's the interesting part. Within just a few days, my world began to change at a pace that was almost dizzying. You would not believe how quickly the trucks full of consumer goods came rolling across the border to us. Before that happened, we could go into the supermarket, which were all owned and operated by the state, of course, and we could get pretty much everything we needed to feed ourselves. Fruit and veggies, bread and butter, flour, milk, sugar, eggs, and so on. Hunger and malnutrition were not a thing for us. I read in a Time magazine article that, quote, there was only so much the 16 million citizens of the communist German Democratic Republic could buy in a sealed off country of scarcity, shortages, and joyless austerity, end quote. I don't think I quite agree with that statement, though keep in mind that as a child and teenager, my perspective was probably a bit different from that of East German adults. Typically, of course, product variety was largely absent. If you wanted flour, you had a choice between two unbranded options, unrefined and refined. They came in a plain paper bag, had the words wheat flour printed on it, along with weight and price, and that was it. But then that's really all we required in terms of our flour needs, I want to say. Once West Germany's trucks arrived, our supermarket shelves became unrecognizable. Suddenly, there were 5, 10, or 20 brands of flour. Actually, there were 5, 10, or 20 brands of everything. Many of these things we had actually been aware of already. You may not know that, but East Germans could actually watch West German TV broadcasting, at least in most parts. We didn't have advertising, of course, but they did. And we had been watching it for decades. East Germans knew many products, brands, and commercial jingles from the screen, even though none of them were ever available to us. Now suddenly they were. Everything was right here in front of us. And that's just supermarkets, of course. As you can imagine, the same was true for all other domains of consumption: clothing, entertainment, furniture, vehicles, etc. And East Germans wholeheartedly embraced Western consumerism. We bought lots of stuff, often replacing the things we had already because they were now so undesirable. For instance, before the wall came down, you had to pay more than 17,000 Eastern marks for a second-hand Trabant. I'll share the screen with you to show you what that looks like. So the Trabant was one of the 2 cars manufactured in East Germany. Within months, who previously had not been able to own anything like that, of course, could buy a well-maintained second-hand Trabi for just a few hundred marks. In fact, whenever my Trabi broke down, I bought another second-hand one simply because they were so incredibly cheap. No one else wanted them. All in all, by the time I got my management master degree and left university in Germany, I had 4 or 5 of them. Perfect car, unless, of course, you wanted reliability, or speed, or comfort. Excellent for a penniless student, though. Anyway, East Germans took to consumerism like a pigeon takes to breadcrumbs. The goods and services that West Germans had been consuming, we now consume too, with little to no restraint. Okay, fast forward a bit into the future. I had worked as a management consultant for a few years now and realized that I did not enjoy maximizing shareholder value. I'm not saying maximizing shareholder value for multinational corporate conglomerates is unimportant, but it's just not what got me out of bed. So I decided to move to New Zealand instead, to Dunedin, in fact. That place kind of reminded me of East Germany in a number of ways. People dressed pretty unpretentiously. You saw almost no fancy cars, and the houses were all cold and drafty in winter. I loved it there from the first minute. And then I was lucky enough to enroll in a first-year ethics paper at Otago University. I had no idea how awesome philosophy was, and that they give you a degree for something so interesting and fun. Quite incredible. I had actually found the thing that did get me out of bed. So here I am now, living proof that you absolutely can reconsider your life choices and change track if you'd like to. Now, for my PhD research, I decided to focus on the ethics and politics of consumption. So I looked at both how we do consume and how we should and shouldn't consume. The main conceptual perspective I chose was the notion of human need. What things do we actually need to live adequate human lives? To the degree that our consumption isn't necessary for our flourishing, it struck me, it is really difficult to justify. We hear parents use such language, such need language, with their children all the time. For example, you might hear someone say, "You don't need another toy, you already have too many." It's no accident, I think, that I was so attracted to the idea of need. Looking back, my basic consumption needs were always perfectly satisfied when I grew up in East Germany. I had all the food I needed to grow and be healthy, all the clothes to protect me from the elements, a home to keep me sheltered, public transportation to get around, and so forth. So one should wonder if the consumption-related needs of East Germans were satisfied. How exactly did the radical change and increase in consumption when the wall came down contribute to their flourishing as human beings? Especially, and here are some images for illustration, especially when our consumerism harms the environment so greatly, for example, consider marine pollution with plastics, and also when our consumerism implicates us in a lot of human suffering, especially in developing countries. I'm not saying that the radical increase in various freedoms in East Germany didn't lead to better human lives. For instance, the freedom to leave the country and the freedom to practice religion, which previously we didn't have. But those improvements in our flourishing did not result from consuming more. In my research, I also became curious about what I call liminal communities. Liminality is a concept borrowed from anthropology. The Latin word limen means threshold. And since liminality is a threshold concept, I use it in my work to refer to communities that stand at the very margins or largely outside of the structures of consumer society. For me, the Amish of America are one such liminal community. The Amish have successfully remained outside of mainstream America by strictly regulating their consumption practices. For instance, the Amish do not drive cars, only horse-drawn buggies. Horses are used because that way the Amish prevent themselves from going very far. In fact, their buggies don't even have rubber tires. You can see that in the picture. They intentionally use steel rims because rubber would make the journey too comfortable, and they don't want that. Again, by making buggy rides unpleasant, the Amish keep close to their local communities. The Amish value the social capital that exists within their close-knit communities so highly that they refuse any and all technologies that would threaten these ties. It doesn't mean they refuse all modern consumption, of course. Whenever some new good or service appears on the horizon, they sit down as a community and discuss what would the adoption of this new thing do to our chosen way of life and to our flourishing, to the way in which we flourish. If it's clear the commodity is incompatible with that value, they reject it. For example, like TVs, radios, and computer game consoles. If it is not clear what the impact would be, they may decide to allow it provisionally, simply to test it out and see what happens. If the consequences are unacceptable, the commodity is verboten, which means forbidden. The Amish too speak German. Notice how radically that differs from what happened in East Germany in 1989. We didn't sit down to deliberate how our flourishing would be affected by allowing Western consumer goods across the border. In fact, we never even sat down and truly discussed which aspects of our East German way of life would be worth preserving to begin with. And in my eyes, that is a huge missed opportunity for large-scale political participation. I find the relative lack of large-scale, intense discussion of how we should and shouldn't consume in New Zealand equally unimpressive. At a time when our global climate is coming crashing down about our ears, the question of what we actually need to live well deserves a great deal of attention, I think. But perhaps actually our current pandemic can help us focus on that a little bit. I think it, to some degree, highlights that we can still flourish in a time when we can't consume, at least not the way we did. For instance, we can still live really well despite being unable to fly abroad for beach holidays and despite the absence of fast food. There's a lot of consumerist stuff that we don't actually need in our lives. Thank you so much for your time and attention with regard to this little talk. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about philosophy at Massey University, you can simply find our blog that we're currently building at the address worldwideweb.masseyphilosophy.com. And if you want to send me any questions or thoughts regarding this webinar, you're welcome to email me too, of course, at m.griggs@masseyacnz. Once again, I cannot promise that I'll be able to respond to each message, but I'll definitely read them all. So thank you so much once again for dropping by today. I really appreciate your time and your attention. And for now, I hope you have a good day and kia kaha.